I wasn't at last year's conference, but when I hear people talk about last year's conference, they always talk about the presentation that Michael Prince gave and talk about what a great presentation that was. So Michael Prince is back. And we have asked him to provide comments on this issue, on the issues around monitoring and evaluation. Michael is the Lansdowne Professor of Social Policy at the University of Victoria. Michael, over to you. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to what I say as well. Because like you in this room, I've just been listening in the moment, making notes, scrambling, knowing that at some point I was going to be asked to say something, and now with this additional pressure put on me of the expectations. Anyways, I think we're in a very important place, and I'm delighted to see that from last year we're where we are now with the national strategy and the development of the 4 pillars. This panel is ostensibly talking about the 4th pillar, about monitoring and evaluation, and then the theme in the pillars are about measurement and accountability. And I'd like to just emphasize that word accountability, because I think one of the points of having all this good work being done in terms of data collection, data analysis, evaluation is then to hold ourselves and hold other people in society accountable for the commitments we've made as a country under the UN Convention, under the soon-to-be enacted Federal Accessibility Act, Accessible Canada Act, and other provincial laws, human rights commitments, commitments under labor agreements between federal and provincial governments, commitments under collective bargaining agreements between unions and management, commitments by small business owners to themselves, their family, and their staff. So there's an accountability piece here that's really important. And that's all for the purpose of what, under the UN Convention, we would call progressive realization. That there's a vision here that we will continue to move forward in a sustained, ongoing way to achieve commitments around full citizenship, employment, inclusion, belonging, respect, dignity, and so forth. And so just to put it in a bigger context of, we can get, the data nerds in the room can drill down pretty deeply, and we can get lost in what's pretty exciting stuff, actually. I am a bit of a data nerd, so I have to admit, when I listened to Gail's 2 PowerPoint presentations, I'll just start there. I think we've been presented with a rich banquet here today. Tremendous, the new findings coming out of the Canadian Survey on Disability. And the officials have rushed hard, I think, to get some preliminary findings out in time for the usual December 3rd anniversary. But you can, for people who've been around for a while, you well know that through 2019 and into 2020, we will see a series of really important releases of additional information, additional analysis of the rich data that's in the 2017 survey. It really is a major step forward, and I think we need to acknowledge that. I want to thank officials at Statistics Canada and Employment Social Development Canada, and advisory officials who've also worked on that, and the community. The National Graduate Survey 2018, I think, isn't one of those big headline surveys, but I think will be, again, another important step forward in understanding the interface between education and transitions to employment and tracking that. And I'm delighted to see an Aboriginal Peoples survey on disability being done yet again. It's been a long time. I hope to see further work done on children. That's still a major data gap in this country that we need to come back to. So there's some there. From what Gail talked about, certainly there's a youth story there that's quite compelling around mental health and cognitive disabilities and learning disabilities. And the issue of being lost in a transition between, and we knew this already, between high schools, but even before that, people getting lost in high schools, not completing grade 12. And the data that will come out probably out of this survey and others about the extent of bullying and the hate crime on the internet towards young people with disabilities. These are difficult issues which we need to talk about, because we're not going to get to employment. We're not going to get to successful educational outcomes unless we talk about some of the violence and bullying towards young women with disabilities and young men with disabilities and trans with disabilities and others. So that's an important issue. The gender story, the youth story. But what I take from Gail's remarks is she's helped us to put into real concrete terms what it means to talk about doing intersectionality or an intersectional way of thinking about disability. Locating disability in relationship to age, or age groups, and the life course experience, the relationship of disability to severity, which for a lot of us who grew up under a social model or have embraced a human rights model, we tend to shy away from talking about impairments and physical limitations and restrictions, but we cannot ignore the fact that severity is actually a very profound, robust, strong predictor of a lot of barriers and circumstances, and that there are some notable differences between Canadians with severe disabilities and those with moderate and those without disabilities at the present time. Another reminder from Gail's work is the co-occurrence, the combination of disabilities that so many Canadians live with. Not just the type of disability or the cause or source of it, but the actual number, the co-occurrence, 2, 3, 4 disabilities. People with episodic or physical disabilities also, because of the lack of supports or barriers, acquiring mental health issues around depression or anxiety, and one triggering another and then compounding and interacting. We still don't understand those well enough, but we need to continue to work on that. So I applaud the survey and the data, and I'm looking forward to the rest that comes out. It'll provide, I think, Emile and his colleagues in looking at the national strategy with tremendous opportunities for options. One other last thing around Gail's work and her colleagues is this concept of potential workers with disabilities, and this estimate of 645,000 or so. And I think Gail was cautious, as a good researcher should be. She said this was a best case scenario, a utopian world. But it's a world still grounded, I think. It's an aspirational number. But it's one also that at least gives us a handle on the scale of exclusion and the kind of characteristics of what that exclusion looks like. If you wanted to make a business case, you could say it helps us to start to estimate the lost productivity, the cost to the economy, if you want to make arguments like that. If we have to make arguments like that to policy and decision makers to get their attention, this really then helps us to specify the cost of exclusion. What does discrimination actually look like? What does it actually cost all of us as well as individuals? Gender dimensions, age dimensions, and so forth. The reality, of course, is, and Gail would be the first to acknowledge this, is the many worlds of employment. Where would these potential workers end up? Some might end up in full-time, full-year employment, but we know that many would have perhaps full-time, part-year employment, or part-time, or part-time, full-year employment. It could be voluntary or it could be involuntary choices around their employment. Some might end up in the mainstream labor force, but others will end up in sheltered workshops or day programs or in a cycle of training, vocational rehab programs, and have a career being basically students of training programs for years and years. Some increasingly will become participants in social enterprises. Others will be in unionized sectors, and others, most perhaps, in non-unionized. So we need to appreciate the many worlds, and as I think Emile said, we need to drill down to the employer and workplace level to get a better understanding of what's really going on. Emile talked about barriers and attitudes at the workplace, but also I think we need to look at the solutions. What is working? Where have successes occurred? And how to make that sustainable. Another one I would add at that employment workplace level is I was impressed yesterday, or reminded yesterday, of the rich experience in this room of service providers. Some of you have been at this for 20, 30 years. And how do we tap into that knowledge? How do we scale up that knowledge, whether it's in Calgary or in Winnipeg or in Montreal or in Toronto or where have you, that rich experience, that wisdom actually that's held within the careers of many of you service providers. At the systems level, Emil talked about, and I know John Stapleton's here. We were at an event yesterday together, and John's done a nice job of mapping out the 9 or 10 disability income programs in Canada, and we do need to better understand the program interactions. And we talk about the silos, we talk about the cracks. I was reminded as Emil mentioned these 9 or 10 disability income programs in Canada, reminded of a study done by the OECD in 2010, which pointed out that 20% of Canadians with disabilities actually receive no benefits from any of those programs. Let me repeat that. 1 in 5 Canadians with disabilities get 0 from those 10 programs. That's a troubling figure, I think. So it's more than cracks. It's deep canyons or chasms where people are lost or have been ignored. And we need to better understand why, what's going on there. Because we know they're not independently wealthy and don't need to rely on services support. The last thing I just wanted to pick up on Steve's comments, I'm delighted he's here, about the work of the Labour Market Information Council, because it really helped crystallize a question I had thinking about the strategy and where we're moving forward on data evaluation and monitoring is, with all these great surveys that Gail enumerated and described, who has the capacity actually to take these surveys and do work with them and convert them into meaningful findings at the local or provincial or at the national or regional level? Who else, other than perhaps a handful of people, a few people in a few universities or in a few government agencies? This is, I think, one of the hardest realities we need to face, and it's a legacy, I guess, arguably the last 20, 25 years of austerity and downsizing and the slow, gradual reinvestment into some of our public infrastructure is, who among advocacy groups, who among disability service organizations, who actually among, to be honest, academics like myself or independent consultants have the sustained capacity and resources to take advantage of this rich banquet of data that's been presented. And what I'm delighted, though, to hear about Emil's comments about a data development and warehousing hub, or the working of the Labour Market Information Council, and this will be my last point, is where are the organized public spaces in our country to help analyze and disseminate these surveys and to engage communities in debate and discussion so that we start to really shift in a major way public expectations, public understanding, and public support for advancing full inclusion and citizenship for all Canadians with disabilities. Thank you very much.